Welcome to Superheroes of Science. I'm Stephen.
And I'm Sarah. We co-host Science from the Experts. Our guests are professionals doing cutting-edge science right now.
They're experts in their field discussing what they know best. So listen up and learn real science from real people.
Subscribe now and stay informed of our latest episodes and show your support. Joining us today on Superheroes of Science, we're so pleased to welcome Greg Hitzroth. Greg is an aquatic invasive species research specialist with the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant and Illinois Natural History Survey. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So we appreciate you taking the time and sitting down chatting to us with about aquatic invasive species. But now that I found out you're also you're at the Illinois Natural History Survey, I want to ask, so do you know why Illinois has an S at the end of it?
No, I do not. Not a clue.
Expected, was it? I'm sorry.
No, that's a no. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I have no idea. But
That's really
well, okay, we'll jump to the aquatic invasive species then. How's that?
that's more my forte.
Maybe that's political history. I'm not sure where that first question went. But so explain. I've already thrown you off completely. Explain really what and how aquatic invasive species.
So it's always good to define what we mean by invasive because a lot of people have different thoughts about what invasive means. So we adopt the definition that they're species that have been moved by people to areas where they haven't been before, so they're not native to these regions. And once in these areas, they actually can cause problems for the environment. So they cause problems with food chains or food webs, impacting sensitive species that are native, stuff like that. But also, they can impact the economy of regions. So if there's a species that's impacting things like boater access to rivers or lakes, that might actually impact how much people recreate on those bodies of water. But it can also impact the health of people, livestock, or wildlife. So sometimes there are viruses or bacteria, or even they play a role in how some viruses or bacteria are spread. For example, flowing water isn't really great for mosquito habitat, but if you have a lot of weeds, a lot of aquatic invasive weeds, sometimes we see changes in water flow, which makes good water habitat for mosquitoes, and then mosquitoes are a vector of, or they transmit diseases to people or livestock. And so really, when we talk about invasive species, that's really what we're saying is that these are things that have been introduced by people through different ways, then actually negatively impact the environment, the economy, or the health of people or animals. So
now, I didn't expect you to throw in by people part. Is it possible to be an invasive species and yet people didn't introduce it?
For the most part, we would say that kind of falls under natural distribution then. Especially with climate change, it gets a little bit tricky when you have species migrating to areas where they haven't been or able to survive previously. But for the most part, really what we look at is how people move things, or like how people have aided the transportation of species. And so sometimes people talk about humans being like the worst invasive species, and I would counter with that saying that by definition, we are moving species around and making them invasive. And so we're not necessarily invasive ourselves, but we are how invasive species happen. So.
Oh, nice. I've not heard it put that way. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. And so what, because it's Illinois, so you're the Midwest, what are some of the major species that you're looking at in aquatic wise in the Midwest? And when I think of aquatic species, I'm thinking of, like Asian carp, or something like that. But you're thinking of a lot larger picture than just like a certain fish, aren't you?
Yeah, so a lot of my work is, so I'm an outreach specialist. I don't go in and manage invasive species myself, but what I do is I work with people to look at how they're spreading things around, and then look at how education and outreach can inform certain audiences who are using aquatic organisms or interact with aquatic organisms to prevent their spread or introduction to areas. So one of the things we look at are aquariums. Aquariums is a way in which unique or interesting aquatic organisms are brought into the United States or even to the Midwest. And we look at how those species of aquarium species go from being in aquariums to actually being in our public waterways. And so a lot of it is either accidentally through aquaculture escape, so when they're being raised, or intentionally dumping from hobbyists who are either tired of the organism, don't know how to care for the organism, don't really know what to do, and so they choose to release it thinking that it will benefit the organism. But what it ends up doing is either harming the organism or harming the ecosystem in which they're released into. So we work with, say, aquarium hobbyists and like retailers of aquariums to kind of look at how we can best prevent new introductions. So helping people to make wise decisions when they're buying aquariums or aquarium species, talking about which species are likely to be invasive or which ones we know to be invasive through the aquarium trade. So there's some things like Hydrilla vericillata, which is sometimes called Brazilian waterweed, or was been sold for as a nacris for a long time.
Oh,
That was a really problematic species in Florida, and we're starting to see populations in Illinois and Indiana, and that's very costly to remove or control. I think I heard that Indiana spent up towards $10 million controlling one lake full of hydrilla. And so this is a species that's very, if you look at like a fake aquarium plant, like it's like the typical aquarium species, really. It looks just like any other like aquarium plant, but it's really brittle, so you can't really pull it out from the water. It actually has turions, which is like a potato, like it's like a aquarium plant potato that sits in the sediment, and it can regrow from that. But also, since it's so brittle, trying to rip it up, what I'm trying to say is that it can actually regrow from little pieces, like a little fragment of the plant itself. So when you're ripping it up, you can get a handful of it. If you throw that aside, you can actually grow a whole other plant from that. And so it's really easy to reproduce. It's really hard to remove. And so really most of the options are like lots of years of herbicide. There's lots of other control options, but like they're all very costly and time consuming.
Mhm.
So, um,
Well, not to mention herbicide,
but
if it's aquatic, that's probably not something we'd love to be doing with the water. So,
yeah, for the most part, they are EPA approved, and
oh, okay.
so there are guidelines that make them safe for use. I think often they get the boogeyman treatment often because herbicides and pesticides. Um, but I think for the most part, as long as people are following the guidelines set up by EPA, that they're pretty safe. And there's a whole bunch of them. And again, that's not really my strong suit, so I don't like myself in trouble to talk about too much of herbicides at the moment. But there are a lot of it's highly regulated, especially around water sources. So you have to have lots of permits if you're applying herbicide in riparian areas or waterway areas too. So it's highly regulated. So
and so since we're on the aquarium side of things, eh, if I'm going to get an aquarium, what's the best? I mean, is it still okay just to go to any plant, any store to get those cool plants for fish and get any fish? Is it still okay to do that? I mean, is it going to hurt anything in my aquarium?
yeah, so for the most part, so it depends on your state and it depends on the species. Some things are hard to regulate. So you can buy things that are known to be invasive. So really, what we try to steer people away from is if you know something is slightly problematic Like definitely don't buy that. Choose something else, maybe it'd be similar. We have some publications that try to get people to choose some native or non-invasive species for aquariums. But if you can obtain it legally, there's nothing we can really do to stop you from doing that. But really what we highly recommend is come up with a plan for how to care for it. Really good planning is important for aquarium hobbyists. So you can't read an aquarium book without the first couple pages telling you that it's a complicated thing. If you want things to survive, you have to do a lot of planning. And part of that planning is understanding the organisms that you're bringing into your aquarium to make sure that they are they work well with what you have. Like make sure that your water hardness is correct, that like the fish are going to get along together, and make sure that you're enjoying your hobby too. So if you enjoy it and have it in your aquarium, you're going to keep it in your aquarium. If you aren't doing a good job with it, more people are likely to get rid of it. And if you come to that point, really we recommend if it's a plant, like taking it and putting it in the trash, just in a plastic bag in the trash is the best way to dispose of it. Getting rid of water, we don't recommend dumping it into storm drains ever, because often storm drains go untreated to other areas, and water can carry eggs or plant fragments like hydrilla fragments, stuff like that. And if you have an animal, we highly recommend working either with who you bought it from to return it. Some smaller retailers will actually take back pets that you're no longer able to care for. But also, if that's not an option, to try to find a new home for it through other means. We have a network of organizations that take back pets through Illinois and Indiana on our website, takeaim.org, or through our Release Zero campaign website, releasezero.org. And so these are just some resources that we try to provide people as an alternative to releasing things. So really, in theory, your aquarium is a closed system. What you put in it should stay in it unless you move it out. And so really, that is the general advice we give people. But there's some things, hydrilla, which are illegal in Illinois and Indiana, they should not be able to get because they are very detrimental to the environment and humans. So some things you shouldn't put in your aquarium just because you shouldn't transport them or propagate them, which means like duplicating them or anything like that. So, but yeah.
And like I say, aquariums are one thing, and I would not have thought about that. I didn't think we'd go to aquariums, and so that surprised me a little bit. But what are some other ways that we, which is only fair because I threw out the why is the S in Illinois? you got to throw some things back. You got to do something to surprise me. But what are some other ways besides aquarium hobby? I mean, say I've had aquariums, several of them through the years and stuff, and I know that I've had luck with some and not so luck with others. But obviously, I got rid of them and then got into it again later since I've had several. But so that is a hobby that I've done myself. And so what are some other activities that people do that might cause aquatic invasive species in the areas?
Yeah, so when we look at invasive species, we really, this is where a slide would be great, but I'm just going to describe what this is. So it's called the invasive species curve. And so there is essentially like a few steps for species to become invasive. I mentioned the first step is people introducing it. So the transportation to an area where it hasn't been before. Either it's intentionally, like with aquariums, where you're trying to buy something novel, or it could be something accidental. So large cargo ships have taken up a bunch of water into their ballast to balance heavy cargo, say in Eastern Europe, and transport that water to the Great Lakes, and this has happened multiple times, and releasing that water with the cargo to rebalance the ship. So that's called ballast water discharge. And that has introduced a whole bunch of things into the Great Lakes, including zebra mussels and quagga mussels, round goby, potentially Eurasian water milfoil. So a lot of species that we are well known to be problematic. So that's another way in which they're introduced. But we also look at the spread. So it's once they're introduced to an environment, they have to be able to survive and reproduce and stay in that area. So if you have a bunch of tropical fish from your aquarium and you release them into Lake Michigan, for the most part, many of them won't survive because they're tropical. I mean, that will change over time with climate change, and we don't recommend doing that at all. But for example, like tropical cichlids are likely not to survive in the Great Lakes. And so they have to be able to establish, and once they've established, spread to new areas and then actually have impacts. So really, the introduction part is interesting for aquariums because aquariums are a way of introducing novel species. But once something's already introduced and established, we start thinking about how people are spreading them around to new areas. So boats or boaters or anglers or people who are actually recreating on the water where they are established. So accidentally picking them up on your gear or their larvae or in the mud, on your gear of your boat or your waders or even in your bait buckets, and taking those from that location where they're infested already to a new location that's uninfested, and either intentionally releasing them or accidentally releasing them. So you can think about not washing your boat. For example, we tell people to wash their boat or clean their boat. Specifically, we tell them to remove, drain, and dry. So that's removing plants and mud from your boats and equipment. Drain all water from your gear, including your bilge, and then dry everything thoroughly with a towel or let it dry for 5 days. So essentially, you can pick up a plant fragment like hydrilla, like I mentioned before. If it's on your prop and you put it into a new location, you're spreading that hydrilla plant to a new location. If you have water on your boat or in your boat, in an area that has zebra mussels or quagga mussels, there are these little tiny mussels that produce many, many offspring, and they're able to spread in water, essentially. So their larvae are able to suspend themselves in water. You put a bunch of water in your boat with zebra mussel larvae, and you put them into new locations, and then you have a new population of zebra mussels or quagga mussels. And so draining your boat prevents that, but really the dry part too, because zebra mussel, they're called veligers. It's just like essentially larvae. They are able to survive out of water for about 5 days. And so wiping down your boat helps to mechanically remove them a little bit, but really letting them dry for 5 days is like, will kill them and prevent you from spreading them to new locations. So that's another way. And really, anytime you buy any kind of aquatic organism, whether or not it's like live bait or if you're a gardener that likes water lilies, stuff like that, really just think about how are you using that and how you're transporting it and where is it going and what's the end use. So for live bait, often when you hook it, like it doesn't survive that very easily. And but like what people will do is they'll have some leftover bait at the end of the day and like think they're feeding the sport fish they want to catch and dump that bait. And that's another way in which a lot of organisms have been transported to areas.
Oh.
And I mentioned like cross-ocean changes, right? So like cross-ocean species being brought to the US, but sometimes it's really pretty local. Like species can be transported from very local endemic areas or even like certain river basins. So in northern Indiana, rusty crayfish is a really common species. It's all over the place. Outside of essentially the Ohio River Basin, it's a very invasive crayfish. So here in Illinois, it's prohibited, but in Indiana, it's a native species. And so even just small geographic changes are important. So if you're out catching crayfish for bait or whatever purpose you want to use them for, and you take them to a new location where you didn't catch them, that is also transporting it to a new location. So when I say invasive being transported, it can be like a lake, it could be a river, it could be like the creek, it could be a very small geographic area. So it's not just across continents or between continents.
When you were mentioning using live bait, I hadn't thought of that either, but that makes a lot of sense to be mindful of that. But then you're speaking about maybe transporting or not transporting, especially if you're, like you said, fishing or trying to catch crayfish for live bait. Do Is any of this enforced by, like, does law enforcement involved with any of this, moving one way or the other, like with the DNR or anything?
Yeah, yeah. I'm a little bit more familiar with Illinois laws, but they're definitely transporting certain species from one location to the next is typically frowned upon. Partially, it's not always just the bait species itself, but like sometimes the water they transport. So some viruses can survive in water and transporting from one location to the next. So really, for the most part, we highly recommend if you're wild catching bait to not take it to new locations, just to make sure that you're not breaking any laws or transporting things you shouldn't be transporting. And that's just the general good rule of thumb for not spreading around invasive species, and even unintentionally. So even if you don't always, if you think you know what you have, sometimes you don't always know what you have, depending on like lookalikes and life stages. So it's best to just not move anything aquatic. So if you're buying things from bait shops, like obviously you can't just like fish at a bait shop. So really that's why we recommend when you're done with your bait at the end of the day, not releasing it, but dumping it into the trash essentially. So.
Okay. Well, the drying, when you got to the dry part about remove, drain, and then dry, that's something I had not, I guess I had not really thought of, but I know it's like my friends have kayaks, and we talked about maybe taking some time off in the summer, and we see how many different streams we could kayak. And so I guess it's might be important at that point to make sure we're drying them off if we're doing them consecutive days, and make sure that there's not something on there.
Yeah. Yeah, take as much water as you can. Bring a towel with you and try to dry off your boat as much as you can. Again, the 5 days, it's useful, if you have a boat and you put it like in your driveway for 5 days, like between weekends, like that's really useful. But really, we try to be practical with our advice, and we try to tell people like good, better, best. So the baseline is to try to dry as much as you can between rivers. So if you're going to 2 rivers in one day, really try to squeegee out as much water from inside your canoe or your kayak as possible. Remove any mud or plants that you may have picked up, and that's usually pretty good. So
Yeah, I think those are things that we don't think of a lot. I mean, we're thinking, well, I didn't pick up any fish or anything, so I didn't transport. But you don't think about how small some of these. There are stages in these organisms where they're very, very small.
yeah, and there's a lot of species that you might not really realize you're picking up, like in mud, like New Zealand mud snails, this tiny little snail, like it looks, oh, it's almost like the size of a pinhead. Like it's really easy to transport, especially like on the bottoms of your waders and stuff. So if you know you're in an area that has New Zealand mud snails, you gotta be very careful with that stuff. So yeah.
Oh, and that would be something to think about. Even like I said, at the bottom of your waders or and stuff. If you're going fishing in from several places, I know I have before. I never catch anything. I suck at it, but I've went with people, and we've went to a couple of different lakes in one day and things like that, and did not even think about the possibility of contaminating another water body.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's why we do the work that we do. We try to remind people to remove, drain, dry whenever we can. I feel like a broken record some days, but it's very important and it's very simple. It's like brushing your teeth.
It's the first I've heard it, so you've reached a
Oh,
note.
good.
One more person. What are the most popular? Doesn't feel like the right word, but I'm going to use it. What are the most popular ways that people do move species from one to the next, or is there the most popular ways that it happens?
Yeah, so sometimes it's hard because some plants and animals are used for multiple purposes, so it's sometimes hard to know. Red swamp crayfish is one that I think about a lot recently. So this is you ever eat crayfish in Louisiana or eat crayfish étouffée or have a crayfish boil, it's usually a red swamp crayfish. So in the Midwest alone, there are 37 different species of crayfish.
Oh,
Red swamp crayfish is actually native to Illinois, but just the very southern tip in the cedar bog. But up in the Great Lakes area, so up in the Collier counties, like it's very invasive. Michigan's has, I think, probably about 8 different populations now. We have some in the Chicago River. There are some found just outside of Milwaukee. The population outside of Milwaukee was, I think, $1 million to control. They essentially turn a couple of retention ponds into parking lots to try to control them.
oh wow.
And so there's some ways in which these species are being transported. So live food, like I mentioned, like crayfish étouffée, but they're also used in aquariums, and like people sometimes use them as bait too. So really, sometimes people try to use what's cheapest available bait, and sometimes live food is what they go to. And so it depends on the species. So in the case of red swamp crayfish, like um, it's hard to say like what's the most likely way that something's been transported, but there's this thing that we call propagule pressure. So if you think about it, like if you throw one crayfish into the Great Lakes, like are you going to see like 100 crayfish in a day or 2 days, like a week? Like you're going to see them in like 10 years. But if you throw, I don't know, 50,000 red swamp crayfish in Lake Michigan, like you're going to see a much faster impact essentially.
Mhm.
So when we think about how things are being transported, we sometimes think about quantities too. So like a 5 pound bag of red swamp crayfish is likely to be more impactful than like one red swamp crayfish. And so when you talk about what's the most likely method, like we have to think about that as well, like quantity wise. Hydrilla is a really good example. Like one plant could actually mean 100 plants depending on how it's broken up.
Mhm.
And so on a boat, a hydrilla is our biggest concern. So on recreational equipment for hydrilla, it's highly regulated. Most states have prohibited it. It's been prohibited at the federal level as well. And so it's a noxious weed. So it's one of those plants where, like, in theory, you shouldn't be able to get it legally, but you know, it still exists out there. And so it really depends on the organism, I would say.
Now, is that the same
But
as the
um,
what's the name of it? Anacris? Is that the same as Anacris?
mhm.
Because I remember it's
Yeah, I think I'm.
years ago we used to use that for eco columns.
Yeah, and I think I misspoke earlier when I called Hydrilla anacris. That's actually a different species. That is, yeah. So sometimes the common names throw me a little bit. But so anacris is Elodia. Ergia densa is the scientific name. So Anacris was the old genus, and then they changed it to Ergia. And so it's often sold as Ergia. Hydrilla, I'm blanking on the common name. I just have been calling it Hydrilla for so long. But they look very similar. They're actually very hard to tell apart. So you can tell. I might get myself into some trouble here because it's been a
You
while since
didn't
I've looked
say
at this.
what
But
it
one
was
has
Anacris,
teeth,
though.
teeth on the leaves.
You didn't say it was
I'm
Anacris.
sorry.
You said oftentimes it was sold as Anacris, and so what you said would be totally accurate.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, it looks just like it pretty much. I think it's going to be hard for a lot of people to tell the difference. And so,
So you started saying
Anacris is also, I'm sorry. What?
no. I was saying you started to say before I interrupted. You think one of the difference might be the teeth on the leaves? You said so the more jagged leaf. Is that what it is?
Yeah. So, yeah. So there's some subtle differences, like the number of leaflets per whorl, which is a term for like when you look at the stem, like how many leaves around the stem it is. But also when you look at the sides of the leaf, like whether or not it looks like it has little like jagged teeth on the edges. So, and I'm switching which one is which at this moment in my brain, so I'm not going to say which one's which. But we have a great publication. I haven't actually like physically held in my hand in a couple of years because of COVID, so it's been a minute. So.
Well, definitely if you have, and you had mentioned earlier that you have some publications that people choose, especially if they're, stocking an aquarium or wanting to get into that hobby that you have. So we would be happy to link up with any publications if they're available digitally to point people in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll happily send you some links after we're done with this. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, we have a few campaigns that we've run over the years. One's called Be a Hero, Release Zero, which again, like tries to get people to dispose of things properly. So that's a campaign that was adopted by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And that's something that we developed in partnership with Illinois DNR. We also worked with researchers at Notre Dame and Loyola in Chicago to look at what's called risk assessments. So this is looking at biological characteristics of organisms that are likely to be invasive. So things like rates of reproduction, like I mentioned before, like the number of individuals is important for establishment. Whether or not they eat at the top of the food web or like lower in the food web, like how big they get, stuff like that. So these biological characteristics sometimes point to whether or not they're likely to be invasive. And they also look at whether or not it's an appropriate climate for some species that might be introduced to survive. Like I mentioned, like tropical cichlids may not survive in the Great Lakes, so they might be considered low risk. And so what we did is we worked with them to look at high risk, low risk species and essentially say that these low risk species, even if they do make their way out, are unlikely to cause problems. And so we created a couple of publications looking at these things are high risk and we know they're in trade. Some are regulated, some are not, but we really would like people to try to avoid them and choose native or low risk species instead. And so those are the kind of publications that we create. So.
No, that's awesome. I'm glad we'll be able to link to that, especially since I'm trying to talk my wife into letting us have a water garden. I want to do it.
Oh, nice.
And so I'll have to look for those to make sure that I'm picking the right species to put in there myself.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Definitely want to
right
do those
on. That's going to be a popular thing for people. It's spring's around the corner, so I'm guessing it's kind of when a lot of people probably start setting those up.
Yeah, I know I'm getting the gardening itch already, and it's only January, so so.
I like planning mine out. I like planning everything out. My wife just rolls her eyes and lets me ramble on.
It's perfect.
So what are you doing on the so a lot are both of these responsibilities, do they fall under both of your positions then? Because with what was the other one, the Natural History Society or Survey, Natural History Survey, do you have different responsibilities under there that you're looking at, or do they overlap?
It's a lot of overlap. So my position is grant funded. So I have to go out and pull in money to do the work that I do. And so whoever wants to give me money to do the work, well, as long as it's in line with the missions of Illinois Sea Grant and Illinois Natural History Survey, it serves us very well. And so I get a lot of leeway, I guess, in the work that I get to do for that purpose. And so, yeah. Yeah.
Well, let me throw a political question at you then. Because I've worked at a university for 20 years, so you hear stuff, right? And I hear people talk about a lot of things, and especially if something's like a grant-based position. And you alluded to the answer already, so this is a safe political question. I'm not going back to the S in Illinois or anything, but
I have to look that up now. Like I need to know.
By having a position that is grant based, how influenced are you by the funding that comes in? If I was to be someone who does funding, but okay, I want to make sure you guys look at invasive species, but I'm really concerned about this. This is what I want you looking at. Do you have to make sure you're mainly just looking into that? And is it ever kind of like, I want to say questionable as far as okay, we're really giving too much attention to one thing, but the money's there, so we have to do it?
Yeah, I mean, so objectively, science should be objective, right? So all science like should just be like you follow what's important. And that is politics too. Like it's hard to say that there's no politics in science. So the things that people care about for whichever reason, like sometimes do get more attention. I think there's a lot of people who are aware of this effect and they really try to balance it out. So you mentioned invasive carp before, or Asian carp. And so that's one of the concerns in the Great Lakes states too, is that there's a lot of emphasis on Asian carp and like they are very important and like they are very problematic and there's a lot of concern around them as there should be. But there's a lot of other organisms. In the Great Lakes alone, there have been 187 different species that have been introduced and established in the Great Lakes, and Asian carp isn't in the Great Lakes yet, but like invasive carp would be 4 different species. So 187 already versus 4, right? So um, technically, I guess grass carp are in the Great Lakes, so like 1 invasive carp's in the Great Lakes. But trying to balance out a invasive carp with all the other species is something that people actively work to do. So they look at how money is being spent in the Great Lakes and which species they're being spent on, and try to make sure that it's equitable to some degree. I mean, some of it's a little bit different, like red swamp crayfish, like is of concern, but like, is it of big of concern as Asian carp or invasive carp? Maybe, maybe not. It really depends on who you're asking. But like, there are a lot of people who are looking at that to make sure that red swamp crayfish are still being looked at and not just all Asian carp all the time or invasive carp all the time. I'm trying to use invasive carp. It's a recent DEI initiative to kind of make it more accessible. So get away from Asian and try to get into saying invasive. It's a challenge. I've been doing this for about 9 years and like just recently trying to like make that change into invasive carp, but I think it's worth doing too. It's just a little side note, but
Well, and that makes sense too. Just speaking about the other, that you would have some checks and balances. So yeah, maybe you do start looking at whatever species you might be researching with it being invasive, but that you might have other groups that would be, hey, oh, this is great, but we want to make sure we're also keeping an eye on some other things too. So I think that's good to point out.
yeah, and there's some colleagues at the Nature Conservancy in Northern Indiana, Lindsay Chatterton, and also a colleague at the Great Lakes Commission, Ceci Weidberg. They did an interesting study looking at like how the money is being spent through. There's this really great program. It's a bipartisan program. So speaking of politics, it's really well liked by both sides of the aisle. That's called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. It's been my how I've been funded for the last 10 years to do this work. And so it's the aim, and I'm probably going to butcher that in a great mission statement, but I'm going to paraphrase it. But essentially, it's essentially to enhance the Great Lakes through ecological stewardship, but also like economic development. So it's a nice way of looking at how the Great Lakes play into the environment of the communities, but also the economies of those communities as well. So like ecotourism is very important. And we're starting to see a lot of that along the lake shores and the rivers in the area that are being benefited by this program. And so, but the study essentially looked at like how this money is being spent and like looking at just making sure that like there's a wide net being cast of concern. So not just focusing on one species per se.
Yeah.
So.
No, perfect. Good. Good. Is it, you don't know when you hear the campaigns, is it because it's a high risk, or is it because there is someone with a deep pocket who cares about that one thing? And so you wonder when you hear about it.
Yeah, and that's why we really focus on what we call pathway of introduction. So like aquariums and boaters and anglers, like looking at how people are spreading like all species around. So because honestly, 187 species is a lot to put on a poster. So we're not going to tell people to look out for 187 different species. Like I can barely like keep three in my mind at the same time. Um, so really we look at like how people are doing things and like working with those groups to make sure that those groups are not transporting anything. So when we have a campaign, we really try to make sure that it's as effective and as inclusive as possible to make sure we cast a wide net. So boaters can transport a lot of things around, not just Asian carp. So
Well, it's like I said, that's one thing I always ask is, but what can I do? You know, especially we're talking about like climate stuff, and like it's everything seems so big, and it's like I can't fix all the invasive species. I always like, you know, what can I do? And I love the fact that you've done such a good job. Everything you said was things that we can do. I mean, that's the big things we talked about. I was nervous at first because you're like, oh, the boat ballast water. I'm like, well, I can't do anything about that. You know, I don't have one of these big ships. You know? But then you start jumping into things that we can do as people, and that's what I love, and that's what I appreciate so much. We can tell you do some outreach because you went in right into the what do you do? What can you do?
yeah, yeah, staying on point.
Yep. And that's what we need to know. That's what we, as in just the people, the average Steves, need to know. We need to know what is it out there that we can do. And so I like that you went pretty much everything I could think of that I would do in the water. I think you talked about. So it's, you know, it's I know my buddy with the kayaks, the ones that do kayaking. I want to make sure I'm going to say, hey, do you know what you're supposed to do? Which he probably does. He's even quicker than I am with this type of thing. But hope I'll cut that out. So
Yeah.
I said that.
Yeah, and I highly recommend learning as much as you can, but like I think it's important to like talk to people about it too. So like talk to your fishing buddies about like cleaning their gear. Like it's important to have a community of people that are concerned about it, not just a sign by like a boat ramp or like me handing you a brochure. It's important for people in the community to want to do this as well. Like we work with people who reach out to work with their lake management associations, so like their homeowners associations or like organizations like the Friends of Lake Catherine, like up in Northern Illinois, who want to take the time to put up signs and like do outreach themselves. So we try often to teach teacher too. So we try to take educational materials and give them to people who will actually give them out to other people as well. So we always try to emphasize the passing of information is as important as creating information. So
Absolutely. And it just kind of reminds me of like not only leading by example, but also just, you know, using best practices when you're out enjoying these sorts of things, and that you might have a friend that's either to the sport or new to or maybe just hasn't done it in a while. And if you're trying to make an effort to do what's right and not spread these, you're helping others know that as well. So that's
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I would say if I would challenge the people listening that if you already knew some of these, make sure someone else knows. And so, and if you didn't know, if you learned something, still make sure someone else knows. And so, that'd be awesome. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking time and chatting with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Science from the Experts from Purdue University Superheroes of Science.
If you like this episode, subscribe, give us a positive review, and share the love. Boiler up!
Hammer down.